After years of enduring our HOA's iron grip, they finally overstepped by jacking up my fees over 3 cars in my own driveway. A work truck for my construction gig, my wife Sarah's SUV for her hospital shifts, and a used Honda we'd bought for our daughter's 16th birthday, all perfectly reasonable. But last Tuesday, a glaring orange notice slapped on my door declared war, a $500 monthly fee hike for excessive vehicles. And I knew this was personal, courtesy of Karen Mitchell, our power-hungry HOA president who'd been itching to flex her clipboarded authority. From my kitchen window, I watched her strut her morning inspection, pink clipboard in hand, snapping pics of my driveway for the 3rd time that week. Sarah suggested stashing the Honda in our garage, but I refused. It was full of her medical supplies and my tools, a fact we'd explained at the last meeting, only for Karen to smirk. Rules are rules, Mr. Thompson, hinting our lifestyle didn't fit her pristine vision. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that for 5 years I'd been quietly buying up neighborhood properties through my real estate company, Sunrise Properties, using different LLCs to mask my moves. An investment strategy turned secret weapon. And now, with 67% of the development mine, it was time to show Karen who really owned this place. I stepped outside to grab the mail, deliberately slow, catching Karen's sidelong glare as she pretended to fuss over Mrs. Johnson's rose bushes. Poor Mrs. Johnson, fined last month for 2 vibrant blooms disrupting the HOA's color harmony, when my phone buzzed with my lawyer's text. Property closing complete, you now own 67%. Smirking, I tucked it away as Karen power-walked over, her voice dripping fake sugar. I trust you got our notice about the vehicle violation, Mr. Thompson. I stayed calm, questioning the fee's legality, but she waved it off, claiming the board's full authority, her barb about my meeting attendance a jab at my supposed ignorance. Little did she know I'd attended every one via proxies from my properties, cataloging her every selective fine and power grab. As she clicked away in her designer heels, she tossed back news of an emergency meeting tonight at 7 p.m. to tackle problem properties. And I saw her snap more pics of my daughter's car pulling in. My blood boiled, but I held it in, texting my lawyer to prep the documents. Karen's move was tonight, and mine would be bigger. Inside, I spread property maps across my desk, each lot highlighted. 5 years of stealth acquisitions, evidence of Karen's escalating tyranny. From fining Mrs. Johnson to ignoring her cronies, violations, all while I'd watched, waited, learned from my dad's lesson 20 years ago when an HOA forced him to sell his first house cheap. His framed photo stared back, a reminder to fight smart, not mad, and as my phone rang with Mrs. Johnson sobbing over another notice, I checked my watch. 6 hours till the meeting, Karen playing hardball over a few cars, oblivious to the storm I'd unleash. I walked into the community center, tension thick, every seat taken, neighbors whispering as Karen tapped her sparkly pink gavel. A photographer she'd hired flashing shots of my driveway, twisting 3 cars into a used car lot on her PowerPoint. Her Tuesday night timing was deliberate, sidelining working families, but I sat in the back, quiet, letting her perform her smug routine. Karen droned on, slides of my daughter's car, parked 48 hours because she was home from college, paired with charts of fake property value drops and anonymous complaints, likely from her clique, while her binder tracked my family's every move, unsettling even her loyalists. Sarah Jenkins, my next-door neighbor, stood, calling it excessive, but Karen snapped her down, her husband Bob passing out a new bylaw, 2 cars max, garage-only parking, a laughable overreach. As Karen called for a vote, I rose, tie straightened. Point of order, Madam President, citing bylaw 7.3 to halt her. Her nails gripped the podium as I strolled forward, unveiling my map, announcing Sunrise Properties, my company, owned 67% of the HOA, her face paling as the room buzzed, her gavel tumbling when I hinted at her shady surveillance, the game shifting under her feet. The meeting room crackled with unease as I stood at the front, Karen's sparkly gavel lying toppled beside her podium, her smug facade slipping as I laid out my property map. Sunrise Properties, my company, now controlled 67% of the development, a fact that hit the room like a shockwave, murmurs rippling through neighbors who'd felt her iron fist for years. Before we vote on these absurd fees, I said, voice steady despite my pounding heart, let's review the HOA's ownership structure, pulling out deeds from my briefcase. Each one a testament to 5 years of silent acquisitions, stacking them deliberately as Karen's face drained of color. She'd targeted my family over 3 cars, my work truck, Sarah's SUV, our daughter's Honda, but hadn't counted on me turning her game board upside down. I'd watched her reign grow unchecked, finding Mrs. Johnson for tall flower pots while Susan's purple fence got a free pass, and now her selective empire was teetering. I've seen this board ignore real issues, I continued. Harassing good people over trivia, flashing a photo on the screen. Karen, caught by my security cam at 3 a.m., measuring my grass with a ruler, gasps echoing as I added shots of her ignoring her friends. Violations right after they hired her son's landscaping crew. Karen sputtered, "That's not true, I enforce fairly." But her trembling hand spilled water on her blouse as the room buzzed. Neighbors nodded, recalling her double standards, like Mrs. Rodriguez fined for her grandson's car or Mr. Chen dinged for a snowstorm parking slip. The kicker, I said, lifting the deeds. Sunrise Properties makes me the majority HOA owner, completely legal, vetted by 3 law firms. Dropping another folder. And here's 32 signed complaints about harassment, selective enforcement, suspicious fees. The dam broke. Mrs. Johnson stood, voice quaking. They fined me $200 for unshoveled snow while I was in the hospital. Others chimed in, their stories piling up as Karen banged her gavel in vain, her husband Bob whispering frantically in her ear. I moved to dissolve the board, I declared. New elections, term limits, no more 3 a.m. grass checks. And Mr. Chen seconded, hands shooting up as Karen grabbed her purse, yelling, "Meeting adjourned." But I countered. Bylaw 7.3 says you need a majority and you don't have it. Gesturing to my deeds, we're just starting. Let's talk those $50,000 pool fees from last summer, bank records included. Karen slumped against the wall, pale, as a news van rolled into the lot. I'd tipped them off about our reorganization, and the next hours peeled back years of her secrets, my planning paying off, though the best was yet to come. Monday morning, my lawyer's office buzzed with 20 furious voicemails from Karen. She dug up my property records over the weekend, threatening lawsuits for my secret takeover. Her true colors blazing as she went door to door with fake docs claiming I'd turn our suburb into a car lot, some neighbors swallowing her lies. She caught my cameras sneaking onto my property at midnight, snapping license plates, then filed a suit alleging my purchases broke HOA rules, seeking to freeze my voting rights. But my lawyer unleashed our ace. 5 years of meeting videos showing her favoritism, checks proving she'd funneled HOA cash to her backyard, emails bragging about keeping undesirables out, her reign laid bare in court. The judge's eyes widened at 3 a.m. grass measuring footage, her targeting my daughter's car, notes she'd left on doors. Her lawyer squirmed as ex-board members testified to her bullying, her Hawaii trips funded by fines, her social media mocking the elderly for unpaid dues, captioned from Maui. "Thanks, rule breakers, keep those violations coming." Karen exploded. "He's destroying our perfect neighborhood." Ranting about those communities with free parking, but the judge dismissed her suit, ordering an HOA audit as she stormed out, emailing her resignation, blaming big money. News vans swarmed my house for the final hearing. She'd hoped to pressure me, but I greeted them with spreadsheets. Suspicious fees favoring her pals, her hypocrisy caught on cam, her smile vanishing in court as we played her pool party boast. "Of course I make up violations, how else do we control who lives here?" Her fall sealed, my majority poised to rewrite the rules. The courtroom hummed with tension as Karen's smug smile melted away, her fake pearl necklace no match for the evidence piling up. My lawyer rolled out photos of her own house flouting rules. A garish purple mailbox, an overgrown garden, her son's 4 cars cluttering the street, all ignored while she hounded us over trivia like my 3 cars. Her secret Facebook group flashed on screen, her words damning. "Let's see how long the Thompsons last with these new fees. Maybe they'll sell to someone suitable." And the judge leaned in, riveted, as we played her pool party recording, her voice sneering. "Of course I make up violations, how else do we control who lives here?" The gavel slammed, not just ousting her from the board, but ordering her to repay $14,789.92 in unfair fees, her face crumpling as the total sank in, sweeter than any revenge I'd imagined. Outside, news vans, her last-ditch ploy to shame me, swarmed my house. But I met them with a grin, spreading color-coded spreadsheets of years of her crony-favoring fees. Reporters gasping at 3 a.m. grass-measuring footage while her own yard broke every rule, her hypocrisy now public fodder. Corinne's fall traced back to that emergency meeting, where I'd flipped her game. Her PowerPoint of my used car lot crumbling as I unveiled my 67% ownership via Sunrise Properties, deeds fanning out like a winning hand, her gavel tumbling when I exposed her surveillance obsession. The room had erupted, neighbors like Mrs. Johnson airing her hospital fine, Mr. Chen seconding my motion to dissolve the board. Corinne fled, yelling about lawyers, but my majority held firm. And as news crews I'd tipped rolled in, we'd begun dismantling her reign, pool fee records hinting at deeper rot. Her weekend panic, voicemails, lawsuits, midnight trespassing, only fueled our court win, my 5-year archive of videos, checks, and emails burying her. Ex-board members confessing her bullying, her Hawaii jaunts funded by our fines, her resignation a bitter retreat as she blamed big money in a mass email. With her gone, I leveraged my majority to birth a new HOA. 5 residents elected, including Mrs. Rodriguez, once fined for cooking smells, and Mr. Chen, whose exotic garden Corinne despised. Rules flipped fast. Kids could shoot hoops in driveways, gardens grew veggies, not just flowers, and families parked freely within their space, my 3 cars now a non-issue. 3 weeks later, Corinne's moving truck rumbled up, her final letter whining about higher standards elsewhere. Ironic, given the parking ticket on her windshield as she peeled out. And that evening, my daughter parked beside my truck and Sarah's SUV, a small sign rising. Welcome to Thompson Hills, where good neighbors make good neighborhoods. A TV producer called next morning, hooked by the news, pitching a documentary on our HOA revolution. Kids played freely, neighbors chatted over fences, and I grinned, imagining Corinne watching from her new 1-car garage hell, our property values spiking 15% in a month, proving respect trumped her fear. This all sparked from that orange notice over my driveway, Corinne's clipboarded tyranny pushing me to weaponize my quiet property grabs. 5 years of watching her find Mrs. Johnson's roses, ignore Susan's fence, track my family's moves, her 3 a.m. grass obsession the last straw. The meeting had been her stage, her photographer twisting my cars into a crime, but my map and deeds stole the show, her surveillance binder a creepy footnote as neighbors turned, her bylaw push for 2-car limits dying when I rose, citing 7.3 to halt her vote. Her power slipped, and my evidence from pool fees to midnight snaps sealed her fate. Now, filing away court docs, my phone buzzed. Corinne's new neighborhood watch begging tips on their own HOA tyrant. And I leaned back, Dad's long game lesson echoing. Not revenge, but empowerment, showing others how to stand tall, our garden blooming where her violation pics once reigned. A quiet victory she'd never grasp. The morning sun glinted off my daughter's Honda as it sat proudly beside my work truck and Sarah's SUV, a trio Corinne had once branded a neighborhood blight. Now, with her gone, our driveway was just home, not a battleground, and the Thompson Hills sign stood as a quiet rebuke to her reign. That orange notice, slapped on my door over excessive vehicles, had ignited this war, but it was Corinne's years of petty tyranny. Finding Mrs. Johnson's roses, shrugging at Susan's purple fence, tracking my family's every move. That pushed me to wield my secret. 67% of the development, snapped up over 5 years through Sunrise Properties, a chess move she never saw coming. Her emergency meeting with its staged photographer and PowerPoint of my used car lot was meant to crush me, but I'd turned it, unveiling my deeds, her gavel clattering as I exposed her 3 a.m. grass measuring and selective fines. Neighbors like Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen rallied, dissolving her board, her exit a flustered retreat as news vans I'd called rolled in. Corinne's weekend meltdown, voicemails, lawsuits, midnight trespassing, only tightened the noose. My lawyer's trove of videos, checks, and emails, plus ex-board members spilling her bullying, sank her in court, her pool party boast. I make up violations to control who lives here. The final nail, her $14,789.92 repayment a bitter pill as news crews caught my spreadsheets of her crony fees. She summoned those vans to shame me, but I'd flipped them into a spotlight, her hypocrisy. Purple mailbox, overgrown yard, 4 cars. Blasted wide, her resignation email a whiny surrender to big money. We rebuilt fast. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen on a new board, rules sane. Hoops in driveways, veggie gardens, parking freedom. And 3 weeks later, her moving truck lumbered off, ticketed windshield and all. A TV producer soon pitching a documentary on our uprising, property values jumping 15% as respect replaced her fear. Kids dribbled basketballs, neighbors swapped stories over fences, and I smiled, picturing Karen stewing in her new one-car garage purgatory. Our garden now thrived where she'd snapped violation pics, a symbol of what we'd reclaimed, Dad's lesson to fight smart ringing true. That fight peaked in court, her fake pearls no shield as we rolled out her Facebook taunts, new fees to push the Thompsons out, and footage of her targeting Mrs. Johnson's bird feeder. Her lawyer wilting under the judge's glare, her payback order a sweet cap to years of her iron fist. Filing the last docs, a text buzzed. Karen's new neighbors pleading for HOA busting tips. And I leaned back, not reveling in revenge, but in showing others how to rise. Our playground improved, pool fixed, elderly homes tended with fees once pocketed by her clique. It all looped back to that meeting, tension thick, her pink gavel tapping, my 3 cars blown up on screen as a crime, her binder of my family's movements a creepy overreach, Sarah Jenkins' protest brushed off, Bob's 2-car bylaw handed out until I stood, point of order, my deeds fanning out, her face paling as I owned 67%, her surveillance obsession the first crack in her armor. She fled, threatening lawyers, but my majority held, news crews peeling back her pool fee scams, her power dissolving under the weight of my 5-year plan. Dad's photo on my wall, his lost house a ghost, had fueled this, and now, with Karen's shadow gone, we turned her terror into trust. The producer's call promised a wider stage, our story a beacon. Kids played, gardens grew, and I knew she'd watch, fuming her downfall not just her loss, but our gain. A neighborhood where good neighbors, not rules, ruled, her final letter a footnote to a fight she'd never understood and never would. The evening breeze rustled through our community garden, planted where Karen once stalked with her camera, snapping violation pics. Now, kids darted between rows of veggies, their laughter mingling with the clink of Mr. Chen's hoe as he tended his once exotic plot, free from her fines. My daughter's Honda gleamed beside my truck and Sarah's SUV, a trio that sparked this war when that orange notice hit my door. A $500 fee hike for excessive vehicles that Karen wielded like a club, oblivious to my 5-year play. Sunrise Properties, my silent empire, owning 67% of the HOA. That emergency meeting, her pink gavel, her photographer's shots of my used car lot, was her flex, but I'd flipped it. Deeds spread wide, her 3 a.m. grass measuring flashed on screen, her selective rain crumbling as Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen rose, dissolving her board, news vans I'd summoned catching her flight. She doubled down, lawsuits, midnight trespassing. But my lawyer's vault of videos, checks, and her own words sank her. Her $14,789.92 payback a courtroom coda, news crews turning her shame tactic into my stage. We'd remade the HOA, Mrs. Rodriguez fined for cooking smells, and Mr. Chen, dinged for his garden, now led a board where hoops rang out. Gardens bloomed, parking was free within reason. Karen's moving truck rolled off 3 weeks later, ticketed and bitter. Her higher standards led her a laugh as our values soared 15%, a TV producer eyeing our tale for the world. That fight traced to her PowerPoint, my car's a supposed blight, her binder tracking us a step too far. Sarah Jenkins' objection swatted, Bob's 2-car rule pushed, until my point of order and 67% reveal froze her. My evidence of pool fee scams tipping the scales, her gavel useless against my majority. Court sealed it, her purple mailbox, her son's 4 cars, her I make up violations boast. Her reign ended. Dad's lesson to fight smart in my veins, his lost house a spur. Our garden now a living win where her lens once prowled. Filing docs, a text hit. Corinne's new neighbors begging HOA advice. And I grinned not at her fall, but at empowering others, our fees now fixing playgrounds, pools, helping the elderly, not her clique's pockets. That orange notice had lit the fuse, her clipboarded strut a goad. 5 years of watching her find Mrs. Johnson's roses, ignore Susan's fence, her 3 a.m. ruler my breaking point, her meeting her undoing as I owned the room, her surveillance a misstep I documented to death. The producer's documentary loomed, kids played, neighbors bonded. Corinne's shadow gone, her final letter a whimper against our roar. A neighborhood reborn where respect, not fear, ruled, her Hawaii trips a memory we'd outgrown. That rebirth echoed in court, her fake pearls dimmed as her Facebook taunts. Push the Thompsons out. And bird feeder rants played, ex-board members spilling her bullying, her lawyer sweating as the judge ordered her payback, news vans flipping her trap into my triumph, spreadsheets barring her crony fees. She resigned, blaming big money, but my majority had already shifted the tide. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen's board erased her petty rules, her truck's exit a quiet win. The Thompson Hills sign a nod to Dad's long game, not revenge, but renewal. Now, as I leaned back, the garden thriving, I saw her downfalls ripple. Our story a beacon, property values up, a TV lens soon to catch it all, Corinne likely fuming in her 1-car cage, her iron fist rusted, ours a community where good neighbors didn't just survive her. They thrived beyond her, turning her terror into a legacy she'd never claim and never break. The community garden glowed under the late afternoon sun, a patchwork of veggies sprawling where Corinne's camera once hunted violations. Mr. Chen weeded his plot, once fined as too exotic, while kids raced through, their hoops echoing from driveways now free of her 2-car edict. A far cry from the day that orange notice hit my door, a $500 fee spike for my truck, Sarah's SUV, and our daughter's Honda. Corinne had ruled with an iron fist, her pink clipboard a scepter, but she'd missed my 5-year gambit. Sunrise Properties, my stealth empire, snagging 67% of the HOA. A secret I'd dropped like a bomb at her emergency meeting. Her PowerPoint of my used car lot drowned by my deeds. Her 3 a.m. grass measuring exposed. Her board dissolved as Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen stepped up. News vans I'd tipped sealing her retreat. She lashed back lawsuits, midnight snaps. But my lawyer's arsenal of videos, checks, and her own, I make up violations, boast crushed her. Her $14,789.92 payback a courtroom sting. Her news van ploy flipped into my spotlight, her crony fees bared wide. We forged a new HOA. Mrs. Rodriguez, once dinged for cooking smells, and Mr. Chen led, erasing her petty rules. Gardens grew food, kids played, parking fit our lives. Her moving truck rolled out 3 weeks later, ticketed windshield a parting jab, her higher standards led her hollow as our values climbed 15%, a TV producer hooked on our tail. That clash peaked at her meeting. Her gavel tapped, my cars vilified, her binder of our movements a creepy overstep. Sarah Jenkins' protest ignored, Bob's bylaw pushed, until my point of order and 67% claim froze her, pool fee scams unraveling her grip, my majority unyielding as news caught her fall. Court drove it home, her purple mailbox, her son's 4 cars, her Facebook taunts. Push the Thompsons out. And bird feeder rants, ex-board members spilling her dirt, her payback ordered, Dad's smart fight ethos in my blood, his lost house a spur, our garden a triumph where her lens once glared. Filing the last docs, a text pinged. Corinne's new neighbors seeking HOA tips, and I smiled not at her crash, but at lifting others, our fees now healing the neighborhood, not her clique's greed, playgrounds fixed, elderly homes tended. That notice had sparked it, her strut, her ruler at 3 a.m., her fines on Mrs. Johnson's roses while Susan's fence stood. I'd watched, documented, struck when she overreached, my deeds her undoing, her surveillance a misstep I'd turned lethal. The producer's lens loomed, kids roamed, neighbors bonded. Corinne's rain dust, her letter a footnote. Thompson Hills a nod to Dad's lesson. Not revenge, but rebirth, a place where respect outshone fear, her Hawaii trips a faded scam we'd outlasted. That rebirth rooted deep. Court had stripped her bare, her fake pearls dull as her control who lives here. Sneer played, news vans catching my spreadsheets of her bias. Her resignation a squeak against our roar. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen's board rewrote the rules. Her trucks exit a quiet win, the sign a testament to a fight won smart, not mad. Now, as I leaned back, the garden pulsed. Our story a beacon, values up. A TV tale brewing, Karen likely stewing in her one-car trap. Her fist rusted, ours a community thriving beyond her reach. Her terror flipped into trust. But a late call jolted me. A neighbor spotted a flyer at the edge of town. Karen Mitchell Realty, specializing in HOA? Wasn't done, her shadow creeping back, testing if our roots could hold against a new play. One I'd meet with the same quiet steel that toppled her once, ready to show her again who really owned this game. The community garden thrummed with life as dusk settled, its rows of vegetables a defiant bloom where Karen's violation picks once reigned. Mr. Chen pruned his exotic plot. Kids shot hoops in driveways unburdened by her two-car rule, and the Thompson Hills sign stood proud, a quiet flip to her iron fist, all sparked by that orange notice slapping my door, a $500 fee hike for my truck, Sarah's SUV, and our daughter's Honda. Karen's pink clipboard had ruled us, but she'd missed my ace. Sunrise Properties, my 5-year stealth grab of 67% of the HOA, unleashed at her emergency meeting. Her used car lot slides drowned by my deeds, her 3 a.m. grass measuring bared, her board toppled as Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen rose. News vans I'd called catching her flee. She'd swung back lawsuits, midnight prowls, but my lawyer's stash of videos, checks, and her I make up violations quip sank her. Her 14,789.92 payback a courtroom gut punch. Her news van stunt turned into my megaphone, her crony fees exposed raw. We'd rebuilt, Mrs. Rodriguez fined for cooking, and Mr. Chen, dinged for his garden, led a board that freed us. Veggie patches, free play, parking sane. Her moving truck peeled out 3 weeks later, ticketed and sour. Her higher standards led her laughable as our values spiked 15%, a TV producer eyeing our saga. That fight flared at her meeting. Her gavel rapped, my car's damned, her binder of our moves a creepy tell. Sarah Jenkins, pushback dismissed. Bob's bylaw shoved until my point of order and 67% bombshell froze her, pool fee scams unraveling her. My majority iron as news sealed her doom. Court nailed it, her purple mailbox, her son's 4 cars, her push the Thompsons out, taunts, ex-board confessions, her payback mandated. Dad's smart fight ghost drove me. His lost house afire, our garden a win where her lens once sneered. Filing docs, a text hit. Karen's new neighbors craving HOA hacks. And I grinned not at her fall, but at lifting others, our fees now mending playgrounds, aiding the elderly, not her pals, pockets. Her Hawaii scams faded. That notice had lit it. Her strut, her ruler at 3 a.m., her fines on Mrs. Johnson's roses, Susan's fence ignored. I'd tracked her, struck with deeds, her surveillance my ammo, the producer's lens looming as kids roamed, neighbors knit. Her rain ash, her letter a whimper, our sign a nod to Dad. Not revenge, but renewal, respect over fear. Court had gutted her, her pearls dim, her control who lives here sneer-aired, news vans flipping her trap, her resignation a squeak. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen's board erased her rules. Her trucks exit a quiet score, our story a beacon, values up, TV brewing. Karen stewing in her one-car cage, her fist rusted, hours thriving beyond her grasp. But that night a call rattled me. A neighbor flagged a flyer. Karen Mitchell Realty, specializing in HOA communities, spotted at town's edge. She wasn't out, her shadow slinking back, a new game testing our roots. I called my lawyer, voice low. Her realty gig screamed revenge, maybe a proxy for her old allies, sniffing our land's value after our win. And he dug fast, finding her linked to a shell LLC eyeing properties nearby, her name buried in fine print. Mrs. Rodriguez texted next. Karen had pitched her services to a neighbor, hinting at restoring order here. And I felt the old fire flare, Dad's lesson sharp, fight smart, not mad. I rallied Mr. Chen and Sarah Jenkins, our new board tight. Her flyer was a probe, but we'd fortified. Bylaws locked, neighbors alert, my 67% a shield. She'd find no cracks, only steel, and as I eyed the garden, kids laughing, I knew her next move would hit a wall, my quiet war chest ready, her comeback a match for the flame that took her down once and would again. The community garden pulsed under the morning sun, its vibrant rose a testament to our defiance where Karen's camera once prowled. Mr. Chen tended his exotic plot. Kids' basketballs thumped in driveways free of her two-car dictate. And the Thompson Hills sign gleamed, a quiet triumph over her iron rule, sparked by that orange notice slamming my door. A $500 fee jump for my truck, Sarah's SUV, and our daughter's Honda. Karen's pink clipboard had lorded over us, blind to my 5-year play. Sunrise Properties, my stealth hold on 67% of the HOA, dropped like thunder at her emergency meeting. Her used car lot slides fatting as my deeds fanned out. Her 3 a.m. grass measuring exposed. Her board crumbling under Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen's rise. News vans I'd tipped sealing her exit. She clawed back lawsuits, midnight snaps. But my lawyer's haul of videos, checks, and her I make up violations, snarl buried her. Her $14,789.92 payback a courtroom reckoning. Her news van gambit flipped into my spotlight, her crony fees laid bare. We reshaped the HOA, Mrs. Rodriguez once fined for cooking, and Mr. Chen, hit for his garden, led a board that unshackled us. Veggie gardens flourished, kids played, parking fit our lives. Her moving truck lumbered off 3 weeks later, ticketed windshield a jab. Her higher standards let her empty as our values soared 15%. A TV producer hooked on our fight. That clash ignited at her meeting. Her gavel struck, my car's damned, her binder of our moves a twisted overreach. Sarah Jenkins' stand brushed off, Bob's bylaw forced, until my point of order and 67% reveal froze her. Pool fee scams peeling her apart, my majority unbowed as news caught her fall. Court drove it home, her purple mailbox, her son's 4 cars, her push the Thompsons out, taunts, ex-board tailies, her payback ordered. Dad's smart fight spirit fueled me, his lost house a spark, our garden a victory where her lens once glared. Filing the last docs, a text buzzed, Karen's new neighbors seeking HOA wisdom. And I smiled, not at her ruin, but at empowering others, our fees now healing playgrounds, aiding the elderly, not her clique's greed, her Hawaii scams dust. That notice had triggered it. Her strut, her 3 a.m. ruler, her fines on Mrs. Johnson's roses, Susan's fence spared. I'd tracked, struck with deeds, her surveillance my weapon, the producer's lens looming as kids roamed, neighbors fused, her reign gone, her letter a whisper, our sign a tribute to Dad. Not revenge, but rebirth, respect over fear. But her flyer, Karen Mitchell Realty, specializing in HOA communities, changed the game, her shadow creeping back, my lawyer tying her to a shell LLC eyeing nearby lots. Mrs. Rodriguez flagging her restore order pitched to a neighbor, her comeback a test of our steel. I rallied the board. Mr. Chen, Sarah Jenkins, our bylaws locked tight, neighbors on watch, my 67% a fortress. And we struck. A public meeting aired by the producer's crew, where I flashed her flyer, her LLC's moves, our deeds a wall, warning her off as cameras rolled, our garden panned as proof we'd hold. Karen's realty faltered, clients dropped, her order spiel mocked online, her shadow shrinking under our light, and a final call from her new HOA hit. She'd been fined for her own violations, her 1-car rule biting back, irony thick. Standing in the garden, kids laughing, I planted a last seed. Dad's lesson full circle. Fight smart, win quiet. Our values hit 20%, the documentary aired, Karen's name a cautionary tale, her fist rusted, ours a community unbreakable, her terror flipped into trust. A neighborhood not just surviving her, but thriving beyond her, roots deep, her comeback crushed, our story a beacon. And as dusk fell, I knew we'd faced her last play and won for good.